In the last few years, numerous articles have been popping up singing the praises of Mitt Romney, coming from, oddly enough, left-wing sources. Recently, it's been for marching with Black Lives Matter protesters. Before that, it was for voting to convict in President Trump's impeachment trial earlier this year, being the only Republican in either House of Congress to vote against the president. He's not the only one that's received such glowing treatment either. Former Senator John McCain and former President George W. Bush have also received similar rehabilitation efforts recently. All across the media, there exists a common implied refrain. Where have all the good Republicans gone? The simple answer is, the good Republicans are dead, and we killed them. Now, to be sure, there are still good, decent Republicans in the party today, of all backgrounds and ideological persuasions. But it is undeniable today that the Romney-McCain-Bush style of Republican candidate, so often referred to as the good Republican, has effectively gone extinct, especially at the presidential level. The 2016 nomination and election of Donald Trump for president shows this most clearly. However, it's not the question of whether this has happened to the party that I'm interested in here. It's the question of why has this happened in the first place. Allow me to take you back in time several decades. The year is 1968. The Democratic National Convention that year has convened, surrounded by protests against the nomination of Hubert Humphrey and the war in Vietnam. In the midst of these protests, two men sat and had a televised debate on the issues. On one side sat William F. Buckley, founder and editor-in-chief of the National Review, and on his left sat Gore Vidal, noted left-wing writer and journalist. The Buckley-Vidal debates set the tone for cultural and political battles for the remainder of the 20th century. But what is of particular note is this moment here.
I know you don't care.
As far as I'm concerned, the only sort of pro-crypto Nazi I can think of is yourself. Failing that, I would only say that we can't have.
Now listen, you
the right of assembly.
Stop calling me a crypto Nazi.
Let's stop calling names.
You in your goddamn face, and you'll stay plastered.
While I can hardly imagine that this is the first instance of someone using the term Nazi to describe their political opponents, it shows what political debate can expect to become in the following decades. William F. Buckley was not any sort of Nazi, crypto or otherwise. Yet he was so labeled by his debate opponent on the left, despite having been the only one of the two on that stage who'd actually done anything to fight Nazis, as he had served in the US Army during World War II. As it would happen, he would not be the last of his political persuasion to have such accusations baselessly leveled at him either. One such example, just over a decade later, concerns that of our 40th president, Ronald Reagan. He was accused of being a Nazi, a racist, an extremist. In November of 1980, Coretta Scott King said, quote, "I am scared that if Ronald Reagan gets into office, we are going to see more of the Ku Klux Klan and a resurgence of the Nazi Party." Earlier that same year, President Carter said that Reagan injected racial politics into the election through, quote, code words like states' rights. Christopher Hitchens said that, quote, "Reagan knows 1,000 ways of being sentimental, hypocritical, and cheap." And William Clay, a Democratic congressman from Missouri, charged that Reagan was, quote, "trying to replace the Bill of Rights with fascist precepts lifted verbatim from Mein Kampf." Whatever you may think of Reagan, and there is a lot to think about him, I think it should be a place of common agreement that Reagan, as one of our most ardently capitalist and ardently individualist presidents, was far from a Nazi, an extremist, or a fascist. He was far from the only Republican president to be treated in such a way either. His vice president and presidential successor, George H.W. Bush, was attacked in a similar fashion. He was consistently labeled as weak, a wimp, a coward. Dan Rather, in an infamous 1988 interview, berated him for his handling of the Iran-Contra crisis as Reagan's vice president.
I want you to talk about the record. You sat in a meeting with George Shultz.
Yes.
He got apoplectic when he found out that you and the president were being party of sending missiles to the Ayatollah of Iran. Can you explain how you were supposed to be you're an anti-terrorist expert. Iran was officially a terrorist state. You went around telling...
Explain that, Dan. I wanted those hostages. I wanted Mr. Buckley out of there.
But you made us hypocrites in the face of the world. How could you sign on to such a policy?
Well,
and the question is, what does that tell us about your record?
When he became president and began using the military to achieve American foreign policy goals, both in the Gulf War and in deposing Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, the media began to back off on the attacks of him being weak. Instead, the new attack was that he was reckless, despite consistently high approval ratings following the war, and despite their previous comments. His son, George W. Bush, was treated just as poorly. He was denounced as a warmonger for starting a war which was authorized by supermajorities in both houses of Congress, including yes votes from liberal icons such as Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, Dianne Feinstein, Harry Reid, and Chuck Schumer. He was labeled the global village idiot by the Mirror at the end of his second term in 2009. He was said to be a racist for his handling of Hurricane Katrina relief in New Orleans.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
John McCain didn't receive any better treatment in 2008 either. Of course, there were the old smears of racism and hatred. The New York Times accused him of using racist, quote, whispers and winks without evidence, and Representative John Lewis of Georgia's 5th Congressional District infamously compared him to George Wallace and accused him of fostering an atmosphere of hate and hostility. There were also plenty of accusations of warmongering to go about, too.
And John, you're absolutely right that presidents have to be prudent in what they say. But, coming from you, who, in the past have threatened extinction for North Korea and, sung songs about bombing Iran, I don't know, how credible that is.
To be quite fair, McCain was something of a war hawk in his campaign, and he did in fact sing songs about bombing Iran.
That old Beach Boys song, Bomb Iran? Bomb, 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 bomb. Anyway.
That being said, it contributed to an already expansive list of attacks and smears against the candidate that, whether he deserved it or not, served to force moderate and decent candidates of his ilk out to pasture in the coming years. Though, of course, John McCain hardly received the worst treatment the right would endure in its presidential escapades. That honor, if one could be bestowed upon one of these men, would go to former Massachusetts governor and failed presidential candidate Willard Mitt Romney.
They're going to put you all back in chains.
The word's out that he hasn't paid any taxes for 10 years. Let him prove that he has paid taxes, because he hasn't. I don't regret that at all.
Some people have even called it McCarthyite.
Well, they call it whatever they want. Romney didn't win, did he?
They brought out all the stops for this one. He was called a race-mongering pyromaniac by a Daily Beast columnist for daring to refer to the Affordable Care Act as Obamacare at an NAACP event. New York Times columnist Gail Collins wrote more than 70 columns making Romney out to be an animal abuser for a road trip he had with his dog crated to the top of his car. All of these things are baseless political hit jobs on Romney's character. But I want to focus on one incident in particular that I find to be the most damning of baseless political hit jobs these candidates have seen thus far. Binders full of women. Before I go in depth on what speaks to me about this incident, here is Romney's full answer to the question posed, which was, quote, "In what new ways do you intend to rectify the inequalities in the workplace, specifically regarding females making only 72% of what their male counterparts earn?"
Thank you, and important topic, and one which I learned a great deal about, particularly as I was serving as governor of my state, because I had the chance to pull together a cabinet, and all the applicants seemed to be men. And I went to my staff and I said, how come all the people for these jobs are all men? They said, well, these are the people that have the qualifications. And I said, well, gosh, can't we find some women that are also qualified? And so we took a concerted effort to go out and find women who had backgrounds that could be qualified to become members of our cabinet. I went to a number of women's groups and said, can you help us find folks? And they brought us whole binders full of women. I was proud of the fact that after I staffed my cabinet and my senior staff, that the University of New York in Albany did a survey of all 50 states and concluded that mine had more women in senior leadership positions than any other state in America. Now, one of the reasons I was able to get so many good women to be part of that team was because of our recruiting effort, but number two, because I recognized that if you're going to have women in the workforce, that sometimes they need to be more flexible. My chief of staff, for instance, had 2 kids that were still in school. She said, I can't be here until 7 or 8 o'clock at night. I need to be able to get home at 5 o'clock so I can be there for making dinner for my kids and being with them when they get home from school. So he said, fine, let's have a flexible schedule so you can have hours that work for you. We're going to have employers in the new economy, in the economy I'm going to bring to play, that are going to be so anxious to get good workers, they're going to be anxious to hire women. In the last 4 years, women have lost 580,000 jobs. That's the net of what's happened in the last 4 years.
To me, this answer does everything right. Mitt Romney, a man in a position of power as governor of Massachusetts, not only using his authority to lift up women and put them in senior leadership positions, but going out of his way to do so. He was provided a list comprised only of men. He went out to women's groups and asked for recommendations for qualified female candidates. To quote an article in the Dispatch by Jonah Goldberg from earlier this June, quote, he bent over backwards to work with women's groups to get names of qualified women to staff his administration. He said he got so many recommendations, which he used, that he needed binders to hold all the resumes. In other words, a Republican governor did exactly what feminist groups want elected officials to do. Now, to be clear, Romney's answer isn't entirely accurate. He didn't ask women's groups for candidates. The binders were sent to him unprompted at the beginning of his administration. There's also some room to be perturbed by the fact that Romney's example of women needing flexible hours was a woman who wanted to go home and cook her family dinner, which, while there's nothing wrong with wanting to spend time with your family and be a housewife in addition to being a working mom, it's also not the best look to the groups you're trying to advocate for to be reinforcing traditional gender norms in an answer about giving women options. But these were not the criticisms made of Romney's answer. Instead, he was portrayed as a misogynist. Quote, Romney is the quintessential ambivalent and benignly paternalistic sexist described in Marriage Structure and Resistance to the Gender Revolution in the Workplace. Huffington Post, 2012. Quote, he must have known he would be blasted if he didn't do it. In this day and age, it should be a no-brainer. You should not be asking the American people to give you a medal for hiring qualified women. CNN, 2012. Thousands upon thousands of people took to social media to lambaste Mitt Romney for trying to make an honest answer to a tough question, and to outline how he tried to do what was expected of him in a world where so many CEOs and government officials don't do the same. Mitt Romney, just as so many Republican presidents and nominees before him, was hit by wave after wave of unfounded and uncalled for smears, attacks, hit pieces, slurs, you name it. And he crumbled. Now granted, I'm not a fan of Mitt Romney, or his cohorts of quote-unquote center-right conservatives, and I will likely be making content on that subject at a later date. But I think it's more than fair to say that Romney didn't deserve the treatment he received from the media or from the opposition party, and conservatives took note of this development. Enter 2016. This cycle, the candidate is none other than our current president, Donald J. Trump, a wealthy businessman known primarily throughout the election for three things: doing stupid things, tweeting stupid things, and not giving a single iota about what you, the opposition, or the media has to say about it. In fact, when the media got worked up about something he had said that week, he'd say something even more inflammatory, just to show that your anger means nothing to him. There are so many of these comments, I couldn't even run through them all, or even a few of them. But suffice it to say that we can all think of at least a few off the top of our heads.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best.
Trump was the complete antithesis of everything Mitt Romney, John McCain, and George W. Bush were as presidential candidates. Yet, surprise, surprise, he managed to actually win the 2016 presidential election, despite outrage by the media, despite a rumored party revolt that evidently failed to surface, despite bipartisan support for the idea that he was a bad candidate and had deep moral failings. Despite all of these things, Donald J. Trump became our 45th president of the United States, and, at least for the next few months, continues to hold that position. Now, large parts of Trump's win can be chalked up to outside factors. Hillary Clinton was a historically bad candidate. She had various fundamental factors going against her in the lead up to the election. And of course, there was the involvement of James Comey and the FBI just weeks before the election regarding her email scandals. That all being said, however, a strong portion of Trump's support among key demographics, both within his traditional base in the party and on the white working class converts he managed to pull from the Democratic Party, I suspect has to do with his unwillingness to bend to media or opposition smears, whether legitimate or not. If you speak to Trump supporters and ask why they like him, you'll get some standard answers. He goes after China. He's finally doing something about illegal immigration, etc. But you'll also hear another common answer. He pisses off the right people. Trump himself has even commented on this phenomenon.
They say, I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
That is the fundamental difference I see between candidates like Mitt Romney and candidates like Donald Trump. Trump is a farce of a president. He's incompetent. He's crass. He couldn't tell an act of Congress from his left shoe. But he does not bow to baseless media attacks. He hits back. He doesn't bow to legitimate media attacks either, which is a glaring problem I and millions of Americans have with him being president. But compared to Romney, who has so little backbone that one wonders how he even manages to stand up straight, Trump steals the show every single time. The American people don't want a president who won't stand up for themselves. After all, if they can't stand up for themselves, how are they going to stand up to Putin? How are they going to stand up to China? More importantly, how are they going to stand up for us? The way the media has treated Romney and other Republican candidates, and that they have simply stood there and taken it, or given weak deflections like good little candidates, especially as they continue to use kid gloves with the Democratic Party. And if you don't believe that they do, I encourage you to take note of how many times the media has referred to the Obama administration as scandal-free. The difference in treatment Tara Reade got versus how they treated Christine Blasey Ford, or even how they treat far-left candidates such as Bernie Sanders compared to how they treat Donald Trump. But this continued disparate treatment and weak counters from Republican candidates over the last 60 years has driven the Republican Party first into the arms of the Tea Party and then into the arms of Trump, and it is killing off the quote-unquote good Republicans. Personally, while I find the extinction of Romneyite and Bushite Republicans from the party to be overall a good thing long-term, the turn into the arms of Trump is not only hurting the party, it is hurting the country. We cannot continue to allow the GOP to be driven this way. We need to forge a new path. One where moderates and conservatives alike will withstand these attacks and prove their strength to the American people, where we don't continue to put either braggadocious bullies or cowardly rhinos as the face of the party. Moreover, We need to recognize the media's complicity in creating this state of affairs in the first place, and to call out their hypocrisy in trying to rehabilitate these candidates' images that they helped destroy in the first place for partisan gain. The media has not been acting in good faith in presidential elections. They haven't done so in decades, if they ever have. They only want these candidates rehabilitated because it gives them a cudgel with which to attack Trump and the Republican Party. They want to have their cake and eat it too, by attacking a candidate as extremist and then using them once they're politically untenable to attack the rest of the party for moving further right, regardless if the new candidate is even more moderate than the previous one, such as Romney was to McCain. Finally, we need to reconsider the way we talk about our political opposition in this country. Like their politics or not, it's evident that Mitt Romney, John McCain, both Bushes, Reagan, and plenty of other politicians that have been smeared in this way are decent, good people, at least as far as politicians go. I'm under no illusions that politics isn't a dirty, underhanded business, and presidential campaigns are even more so. I understand that candidates have to attack their opponents and call them out on any faults that they may have, but we should all be able to agree that these kind of attacks are damaging to the republic. Beyond the fact that many of the smears just aren't accurate, when you use these kind of attacks against people where it isn't so, it means less than when you use it against someone where it is. If everyone to your right is a racist, or everyone to your left is a socialist, then when actual socialists and racists start showing up, nobody's going to believe you. And if they do, it won't mean nearly as much as if you hadn't been spending the last several decades playing the boy who cried wolf. We need to retain some level of respect for the opposition, and give credit where credit is due. Or at the very least, reserve strong accusations for where it's actually merited. Fortunately, as I don't wish to leave this on such a dour note, I do see a small ray of hope on the horizon for conservatives. Unlike the Democrats, the GOP has been quite successful in cultivating its backbench of presidential candidates for future years. There's a bumper crop of young, qualified candidates waiting in the wings for future presidential runs, and their political emergence during the late days of the Tea Party and early days of Trump seem to have taught them the lesson that media attacks deserve counterattacks, without the downfalls of Trump's crassness or incompetence. Nikki Haley, Ben Sass, Dan Crenshaw, Josh Hawley, Larry Hogan, and many other young new candidates are ready to enter the fray in 2024 and 2028, and it seems, to me at least, that these candidates may have what it takes to bring back the good Republicans in a bigger and better form than before. We may have killed off the good Republicans for now, but that doesn't mean they have to stay dead.